Now it's time today to talk about the Super Bowl 48 champions, Seattle Seahawks, and their history as an organization, and name who, in my opinion, are the five greatest players in the history of the Seahawks franchise. Now, this is a franchise that came into being in 1976 at the same time the Tampa Bay Buccaneers did, whereas the Buccaneers were terrible out of the gate, lost their first 26 games in the NFL. The Seahawks as a franchise started off much better as an expansion team. That was primarily in part because of players like Jim Zorn and Steve Largent. The Seahawks have had an up and down history over the years. They've had a run where they'll make the playoffs sometimes and then they drop off, make the playoffs sometimes and then they don't. And then obviously the past few years under Pete Carroll have been really good, ultimately culminating in the Super Bowl 48 championship and that dominant performance against the Denver Broncos. But ultimately, I'm here to talk about the greatest players in the history of the organization. Here's some players that just missed the list for me. I look at guys like Shaun Alexander, and I look at guys like Curt Warner, the original Curt Warner, if you will. I look at guys like Dave Craig and Jim Zorn. Those are some players that really stand out to me as guys that some people might actually make an argument to put on the list, but I ultimately left off. Now, surely in a few years, this list will probably be very fluid and very liquid, and there will be a few current Seahawks that probably find their way onto this list. I would be surprised if guys like Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor and Earl Thomas and Russell Wilson, if a couple of those guys didn't end up establishing themselves as some of the greatest players in the history of the organization. But in most of their cases right now, they just haven't been with the team long enough, in my opinion, and done enough yet, in my opinion, to crack the top five list. So here we go. Top five Seattle Seahawks of all time. Number five is a name that a lot of you may not be familiar with because his career was kind of short, and that's Kenny Easley, who was a fourth overall selection out of UCLA in that great 1981 draft class, with other players in that draft class like Lawrence Taylor and Ronnie Lott. And Mike Singletary, a guy like Easley often gets forgotten about. And again, that's because his career was only 7 seasons. But man, he made those 7 seasons count. He was perhaps the premier strong safety of his time. He was a 5-time Pro Bowler, a 3-time All-Pro. He was the 1984 NFL Defensive Player of the Year, a member of the 1980s NFL All-Decade team. If he would have been able to play another 2-3 seasons at that level, he would easily be viewed as one of the great safeties and defensive backs of all time, would easily have a place in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I think someday he might get the call, but it might take years and years down the road, unfortunately, for it to happen. But Kenny Easley was one of the great players in the history of that organization and one of the truly great players of the Seahawks in the 1980s. A hell of a safety. Number four, I will go with Matt Hasselbeck off of those Seahawks teams of the 2000s. Hasselbeck, you're talking about a guy that was acquired by Mike Holmgren when he came over to Seattle. He brought him in from Green Bay. Hasselbeck was a starting quarterback from 2001 to 2010, 10 seasons. And he did some good things for the organization in that time. The Seahawks really became relevant as an NFL franchise in part because of the quality, consistent play of Matt Hasselbeck at quarterback. Wasn't the greatest quarterback in the world, but he was a good quarterback, a damn good quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks. A 3-time Pro Bowler that led the Seahawks to 6 total playoff appearances during his 10 seasons as a starter, including 5 consecutive playoff appearances. They made it to a Super Bowl in the 2005 season. Matt Hasselbeck, I could have sat there and put Shaun Alexander on the list, but Shaun Alexander had 5 really good years where Matt Hasselbeck, I almost said Tim Hasselbeck, had 10 good years and 10 significant years for the Seattle Seahawks, and that's ultimately why I put him on the list. Number 3, Cortez Kennedy. Now we get into the Seahawks that are actually in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. The 3rd overall selection in the 1990 draft out of the Miami. He was a premier defensive tackle of his time, an 8-time Pro Bowler, a 3-time All-Pro, hence why he's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. The 1992 NFL Defensive Player of the Year. I think that was the year he had 14 and a half sacks as a defensive tackle. You're doing work, and you're going to town on people, and as a big kind of run-stuffing defensive tackle, you were putting up 14 and a half sacks. A beast. A member of the 1990s NFL All-Decade team, and one of the few players in the history of the Seahawks organization ultimately go on and be inducted into Canton in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Number 2, the greatest wide receiver in the history of the organization and the greatest skill player in the history of the organization, truly one of the great Seahawks of all time, and that is Steve Largent, who is funny. He was a 4th-round pick originally for the Houston Oilers out of Tulsa in the 76 draft, and they didn't see it in him. They thought he was too small, too slow, so the Seahawks were able to acquire him. He comes in. Here's Jim Zorn as the starting quarterback. Steve Largent gets an opportunity as part of an expansion franchise to play early and play often, and by God, he made the most out of those opportunities over the course of his 14-year career with the Seattle Seahawks. I wonder if the Oilers ultimately regret that decision. He was a 7-time Pro Bowler, a 1-time All-Pro. He had 8 seasons of 1,000 or more receiving yards, which back in his time, you still had, a game that was built more so around the run. So 1,000-yard season still meant something, especially if you were only playing, let's say, 14-game seasons by and large. But even in his case, playing 16-game seasons, 1,000 yards receiving still meant something because you didn't get the type of opportunities that you do necessarily in today's games. Teams just didn't throw as much. And it's not like he had a ton of talent around him. It's not like he had the greatest quarterbacks ever throwing to him. He had serviceable guys like Jim Zorn and Dave Craig, but you're not going to sit there and call them world beaters or anything like that. You're talking about a guy here that had 3 seasons of 10 or more touchdowns. He had 2 times where he led the league in receiving yards, and he was ultimately the player that was able to break Don Hutson's record for most receiving touchdowns in a career. Don Hutson set the mark back in the 30s and 40s with 99. It was Steve Largent in 1989 that finally got over the hump and caught Don Hutson and caught his 100th touchdown pass, which at the time made him the most prolific touchdown scorer as a receiver in the history of the National Football League. He, of course, was a first ballot inductee into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, one of the great Seahawks players of all time. But number 1 on my list has to be Walter Jones. He was a 6th overall selection out of Florida State in the 1997 NFL draft. And it was funny to me with him, going back to that 97 draft, all the hype and all the buzz and all the focus was on Orlando Pace, and everybody was talking about how Orlando Pace could be the greatest left tackle of all time. And I remember watching Walter Jones in college, and I'm like, damn, this guy's just as good. In fact, I think this guy is better. Well, he was. Walter Jones, 12 seasons in the National Football League, only missed 12 games in his 12 seasons, which I think is something notable. That's an average of 1 game a season. It means he was typically able to be counted on as a premier blindside protector at left tackle. He was a 9-time Pro Bowler, a 4-time All-Pro, a 1-time NFC champion as part of that 2005 Seahawks team that many people feel got screwed out of the Super Bowl that year. He was a member of the NFL's 2000 All-Decade team and a recent inductee now into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And I think when all is said and done, at least at this particular moment, not factoring in any current players and what they could potentially be, when I think about the greatest player in the history of the organization, the most dominant player at his position in the history of the organization, I don't think about Easley or Hasselbeck or Kennedy or Steve Largent. I ultimately think about Walter Jones. When I think about the Seahawks, first and foremost, I always think about Walter Jones, and I think he is the greatest Seahawk of all time. Let me know what you think of my list. Let me know what your top 5 list of greatest Seattle Seahawks would be of all time. Next up is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, then the Tennessee Titans, and then the Washington Redskins, and I'm done with this series. Yippee!